The airport was quieter than usual that morning, with the low hum of early boarding calls echoing off the glass walls and polished floors. Jenna adjusted her scarf, glanced at the manifest, and sighed quietly. It looked like another long flight across the country with little excitement, and too many coffee refills. She had done this routine so many times she could almost walk the aisles with her eyes closed, but something in her gut told her today would feel different, not loud or chaotic, but subtly unusual, the kind of difference you only notice when you look back later. As passengers began trickling in, she smiled, offered the usual greetings, answered a few questions about seating and connections. Then a man appeared near the end of the line alone. No family, no noise, no rushing. He wore a dark hoodie, the kind that folds gently around the face, and faded jeans with a black carry-on slung over one shoulder. He kept his head slightly down, moved with the quiet confidence of someone used to traveling, not just by plane, but through life. He handed over his ticket, without a word offered her a soft nod, and stepped down the aisle to find his seat near the back of the cabin. Jenna barely registered him at first. There was something oddly familiar about his posture, but her mind was distracted by a toddler crying 2 rows up, and an elderly woman struggling to lift her suitcase into the overhead bin. It wasn't until she glanced back and saw the man gently standing to help the woman that something shifted in her attention. The way he moved was careful, respectful, practiced, like someone who had learned to offer help without asking, and without drawing attention to himself. He returned to his seat without a single word, and stared out the window, not with boredom, but with the kind of stillness that made you wonder what was going on behind his eyes. Jenna blinked once, then twice. Something about his face tugged at her memory, not quite sharp enough to place, but clear enough to keep her watching. She didn't want to stare, she had work to do, but she found herself looking back more than once as the rest of the passengers boarded and settled into their routines. In her 12 years of working flights, she had seen all kinds of travelers, loud ones, angry ones, nervous ones, but rarely someone so quiet, so grounded, and yet so oddly magnetic. It was as if he carried a story with him and didn't want to tell it, or maybe he couldn't. Maybe it was the kind of story that only reveals itself in pieces if you pay close enough attention, and something told her that story was about to unfold right here, at 30,000 feet, with a man most passengers barely noticed, and a secret that might be sitting quietly in seat 23B. The plane pushed back from the gate with a soft jolt, and the engines began to hum low and steady like a heartbeat beneath the floor. Jenna moved through the cabin, glancing at seat belts, checking tray tables, offering the same practiced smiles she had given 1,000 times before, but her eyes kept drifting toward the man in the hoodie, now seated quietly near the back, his bag tucked neatly under the seat, his hands folded in his lap, his posture calm, but not slouched like someone used to being aware of his surroundings without appearing tense. He didn't ask for anything, no water, no headphones, no help. He simply watched the world pass by through the small oval window, his expression unreadable, not sad, not happy, something in between, like a person lost in memory, or maybe waiting for something he knew was coming. Jenna paused near his row, just for a second, long enough to glance at his face again, trying to be subtle, trying not to stare there. It was again that odd feeling that she had seen him before, not just in passing, but somewhere meaningful, as if he had been part of a moment in her life, even though she was certain they had never met. As the plane climbed through clouds and the cabin lights dimmed slightly, she heard a whisper behind her, not loud enough to cause a scene, just a quiet voice from a passenger in row 24. He leaned toward his wife and said, "He looks just like that actor, you know, the one from those action films, the one who never ages." She chuckled softly and shook her head, said, "He's too quiet for that, must be a lookalike." But Jenna heard it, and the name floated into her mind like a question, not an answer. Keanu. It was impossible, of course, someone like that wouldn't fly commercial, Not back in economy, not without bodyguards or cameras, or at least someone asking for a selfie. Still she found herself drawn toward the back again, not out of duty, but something closer to instinct. She watched as he gently reached out to help a woman 2 rows up who had dropped her reading glasses on the floor. He picked them up slowly with care, handed them back with a slight bow of his head, never saying a word, then returned to his seat without waiting for gratitude. It was the kind of gesture you rarely saw anymore, small, quiet, unrequired, and that made it stand out even more. Jenna stood at the front of the cabin, near the galley, watching the way other passengers began to notice him. Some looked twice, others whispered, just like the couple behind him. None approached, none asked, and yet the energy in the cabin had shifted slightly, as if people sensed something unusual was unfolding just beneath the surface, something they couldn't name yet, but would remember later, even if they never fully understood why. The sky outside had turned a dull grey as the plane reached cruising altitude, and the cabin settled into its usual mid-flight rhythm, soft murmurs, pages turning, the occasional ding of a call light. But Jenna couldn't shake the strange quiet weight sitting near the back of the plane. It wasn't heavy exactly, more like something unspoken that hung in the air, something that made her glance over her shoulder more than usual toward the man in the hoodie, who still hadn't asked for anything, still hadn't spoken a word since he boarded. She had seen travelers with secrets before, angry ones, nervous ones, even famous ones trying to hide behind sunglasses and large hats. But this was different. This was someone who didn't seem like he was hiding at all, more like someone who didn't care if he was seen or not. And somehow that made her even more curious, the kind of curiosity that starts as a whisper in your mind and slowly grows louder until it's all you hear. Somewhere near row 14 a soft sound broke the calm. It was faint at first, almost like someone coughing, but it kept coming, steady, uneven, not loud, but urgent. Jenna turned instinctively and saw an elderly man hunched forward in his seat, his hand gripping the edge of the tray table, eyes shut, breathing sharp and shallow. Before she could move, someone else was already standing up and stepping into the aisle. It was him, the man in the hoodie, seat 23B. Without hesitation, he moved toward the older man, knelt beside him, one hand on his shoulder, the other gently adjusting the man's posture, whispering something too low for anyone else to hear. And in that moment, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Everything slowed. Passengers nearby leaned slightly forward, not enough to crowd, but enough to watch closely, trying to understand what was happening and who this stranger really was. Within seconds, the older man began to breathe more evenly. His grip loosened, his face relaxed. Whatever panic had gripped him had passed, and all Jenna could do was stand there, frozen by the way this quiet passenger handled the moment. Not with fear, not with authority, but with calm, deliberate kindness, the kind that doesn't draw attention, yet somehow captures the entire room. He returned to his seat just as quietly as he had left it, never looked around, never said a word, and never once acknowledged the subtle stares now aimed his way. A flight attendant from the rear galley approached Jenna and whispered softly. That man back there did more for that passenger in 10 seconds than most doctors could have, and Jenna felt the chill of something she couldn't quite explain, not fear, not awe, but something in between, something that made her want to know who he really was, and why someone like him was sitting at the back of her plane alone. The man in seat 23B had returned to silence, his head tilted slightly toward the window, as if the sky outside held more interest than anything around him. But the cabin was no longer the same. Passengers had seen what he did, and though no one spoke loudly about it, the energy had changed. The stillness wasn't peaceful anymore. It was thick with unasked questions and quiet glances. Jenna moved slowly down the aisle, offering water, checking in on the older gentleman, who now seemed calm and alert, as if nothing had happened, but she could feel eyes following her, watching her stop near seat 23B. The whispers were soft, just above the hum of the engines, passengers leaning toward one another, couples exchanging quiet words, Even the teenager in row 17 had taken off her headphones and was peeking over the seat back. Something had shifted. And it wasn't just curiosity. It was that strange shared awareness that happens when people realize something unusual is unfolding right in front of them, something they might not fully understand but don't want to miss. Jenna wasn't usually one to feed rumors, but her instincts had kept her safe for over a decade in the air, and right now they were telling her there was more to this man than kindness. And calm her memory kept tugging at something, a scene, maybe a movie, maybe an interview, a clip. She couldn't quite place she had seen that jawline before. The way he held his shoulders slightly forward, the way he spoke without speaking, it was familiar, not just to her, but to many of the faces now watching from behind their seatbacks, pretending not to be curious, but leaning in just the same. She walked past him again, slowly. This time her gaze brushed over his face, and for a moment, just 1 second, their eyes met. It wasn't long enough to say anything, but it was enough to see what was there behind the calm, something deep and still like water that ran far below the surface. She almost asked him something, anything, but the moment passed, and he returned his gaze to the sky outside, as if the moment had never happened. In the galley, a junior flight attendant leaned toward Jenna and whispered, "I think that's him. You know, the one from those movies my dad watches, the one who's always rescuing people and never talks much." Jenna didn't respond right away. She just stared down the aisle at the man who had stepped in without hesitation, helped a stranger, and asked for nothing in return. If it was him, he wasn't acting like anyone famous she had ever seen. He wasn't hiding, but he wasn't looking to be found either. And that was the part that stayed with her, not the fame, not the recognition, but the way he moved through the world, quietly changing it, without needing the world to know. By the time the plane hit its cruising altitude, the whispers had started to spread more freely, like a quiet fire moving through the cabin, people shifting in their seats, murmuring to the person next to them, casting subtle glances toward the man in seat 23B. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was there, a sense that something extraordinary was sitting right in front of them. And no one knew how to handle it. Passengers who normally buried themselves in their books or their phones were now staring at him openly, some with hesitation, others with curiosity. It wasn't like any celebrity sighting she'd ever seen. The way people watched him wasn't out of excitement, but out of a strange reverence, as if they knew they were in the presence of something rare and precious, but didn't know how to explain it. Jenna found herself walking by his row again, this time closer, still offering the usual service, checking if anyone needed anything, but her eyes kept flicking back to him, as if by some invisible force her attention was drawn to his stillness, his quietude. It wasn't normal, not on a plane, not in a space like this, where so many people are forced into proximity with strangers. Most passengers would shuffle or shift, or even talk to avoid the stillness. But not him. He was steady, unshaken by the quiet tension building around him. A man in row 17 leaned across the aisle and whispered loudly to his wife, "Do you think that's really him, the one from the Matrix? Or is it just a lookalike?" She nodded in agreement, not too loud, but loud enough for Jenna to catch it. The Matrix wasn't the only thing they mentioned. It was his voice too, his calmness, the way he moved through the cabin, as if nothing could shake him. And at that moment, something inside Jenna clicked. She had heard that same voice, that same soft tone, before in interviews on TV, but this time it wasn't on a screen. This time it was in front of her real life, not on a set, but on a plane halfway to Los Angeles. She walked past him and caught a brief glimpse of his face for the first time. It was unmistakable. The way his eyes held that same quiet intensity she had seen in interviews over the years, the same stillness, the same thoughtfulness. But here he was wearing no sunglasses, no disguise, no entourage, nothing at all to separate him from the rest of the world, except the way he carried himself, as if fame had never reached him, or if it had, he had long since made peace with it. The flight attendants had started murmuring among themselves, now wondering aloud if they were really sitting next to him. Jenna didn't respond. She simply went back to her duties, her mind racing with 1,000 questions. What was he doing here? What was he really like off camera? And why did he choose to sit back here in economy when he could have had any seat he wanted on this plane? Was it because he wanted to be anonymous? Or was there something else that made him choose this moment to show up on her flight? The tension in the cabin had grown palpable as the flight pressed on. The whispering had slowed, but not because the passengers were any less curious. No, it was because they were now sure of something, and that something was impossible to ignore. There was a sense of something more than just coincidence, something beyond ordinary, and it seemed to hover around the man in seat 23B. Jenna could feel it too, a slight hum in the air that made her skin tingle, the weight of the world just barely pressing down on the quiet figure in front of her. She found herself watching him more now, not just as a flight attendant, but as someone who knew something was off, something she couldn't quite explain, but felt deep in her bones, something in the way his eyes seemed to look right through her. When they briefly met earlier, it wasn't a look of recognition, not exactly, more like he could see things she didn't know she was thinking, almost as if he was carrying something heavy, a secret, a truth about himself, or maybe even about the world. But it was a secret he wasn't ready to share with anyone, not now, not here. Jenna noticed the murmurs growing again. This time they were louder. The man was the talk of the plane. And still he said nothing. He didn't ask for attention. He didn't try to reassure anyone. But it was as though he didn't need to. He was a quiet force moving through the cabin with every step, every glance, almost daring them to speak out loud about what they all were thinking. Was it really him? Was it the Keanu Reeves sitting right there in the back of the plane? Or was it someone else entirely? And if it was him, why was he sitting there so quietly, so anonymously, as if he were no one at all? A couple of rows ahead, someone finally couldn't stand it anymore. The man turned to his wife and asked aloud, to no one in particular, "Are you sure that's him? I mean, really think about it, the way he moves, the way he carries himself. It's like he's a character out of one of those old action movies." The wife gave him a look of disbelief. "I don't know, I've heard stories about celebrities traveling incognito, but this feels different. It feels like he doesn't want to be recognized at all." And that's the part that made everyone uncomfortable. It wasn't just about seeing a famous face. It was about seeing someone who was clearly trying to disappear into the crowd, and not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The rest of the flight passed in a strange sort of stillness, with only the low hum of the engines filling the gaps between the whispers and the quiet glances. But Jenna could feel it now more than ever, the weight of the secret pressing down on her, the way the other passengers were watching with growing uncertainty. Some were starting to wonder if they were part of something bigger than just a flight, if they were witnessing something important, something that would change how they saw the world forever. And for some reason it was all tied to the quiet man in seat 23B. The plane was beginning its descent when something strange happened. The quiet hum of the engines grew softer, and for just a moment everything seemed to hold still. Even the passengers seemed to take in a collective breath, as if something had shifted in the air. Jenna couldn't explain it, but she felt it deep in her chest. It was subtle but undeniable. The man in seat 23B hadn't moved much since the whispers started, but now there was something different in the way the passengers were looking at him. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something heavier, something darker, almost as if the weight of the entire plane was pressing down on him. Jenna stood at the front of the cabin, watching the final preparations for landing, but her mind wasn't on the checklist or the seatbelt signs. Her gaze kept drifting toward the back of the plane, toward the man who had remained so still, so quiet the entire flight. Her heart beat a little faster every time she glanced in his direction, as though something was about to happen, something she wasn't sure she could control. A woman in row 12 leaned forward and whispered something to the man sitting across from her, her voice just loud enough for Jenna to catch. And in that moment she realized they had crossed a line in their curiosity. They weren't just guessing anymore. They weren't wondering who he was, they were certain. But they still couldn't believe it, the woman said to her friend. I know that face. I saw him in an interview. Once he's not just some actor. He's a man who disappeared for years. And came back with a story that no one could explain, the other woman gasped. Is that him, the one who disappeared from the public eye to get away from it all, to live like a regular person? Jenna felt a chill run down her spine, the kind of cold that only happens when the pieces start to come together in a way you don't want them to. She had heard the stories too, the whispers about the actor who had vanished from Hollywood, who had chosen a life of complete anonymity, who had chosen to blend in with the rest of the world instead of standing apart from it. But this wasn't Hollywood. This wasn't a movie set. This was real life. And the man in seat 23B wasn't just another celebrity. He was someone who had made a choice to disappear. And now he was sitting in front of her on this plane, surrounded by people who were starting to realize exactly who he was. The soft sounds of the cabin were interrupted by a sudden cough from the back, and the man in seat 23B looked up for the first time in what felt like hours. His eyes scanned the room slowly as though searching for something, maybe for someone, and for a fleeting second Jenna caught his gaze again. But this time it wasn't just a passing glance. It felt different, as though in that moment he was seeing her for the first time too. His eyes held a depth she hadn't noticed before, a mixture of wariness and understanding, and something else too, something that made her question everything she thought she knew about him. She turned away quickly, but the questions kept coming faster now. Who was he really? Why was he here? And most pressing of all, why was he so intent on keeping his true identity a secret? The plane was beginning its final descent into Los Angeles, and the lights flickered on softly in the cabin, the quiet hum of the engines, now mixed with the faint chatter of passengers who had stopped whispering, and were now openly staring. No one was hiding it anymore. They were all aware the air had thickened with unspoken questions, and the sense of something important was hanging just beneath the surface. Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something she couldn't predict or control, and it was all tied to the man in seat 23B. She moved down the aisle slowly this time, her movements less deliberate, more automatic, as if her body knew something her mind hadn't caught up with yet. She reached the back of the plane again, passing by him. But this time it was different. She felt it. She could almost hear the shift in the atmosphere as she stood just a few feet from him, her hand hovering near the call button, her heart beating harder than it should. In that moment she turned to him slowly, her breath catching just a little, and for the first time since the flight started he looked up directly at her. The look he gave her wasn't cold or indifferent, but neither was it warm. It was something in between, something that said he knew exactly what was happening around him. He knew everyone was watching, and he knew they were all on the verge of something. But he wasn't going to be the one to break it. It wasn't his story to tell. She stood there, frozen for a moment, caught between the urge to say something and the reality that words couldn't do this moment justice. It wasn't just about recognition anymore. It wasn't just about an actor on a plane. It was about something deeper, something that wasn't meant to be understood right away. Jenna swallowed hard and took a step back, but just as she was about to turn away, she heard a voice from behind her. One of the passengers in row 21 spoke loud enough for her to hear. Do you think he's really gone? Is it true that he disappeared from Hollywood to live like a regular person? The words hit Jenna like a wave, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. But she didn't turn around. She couldn't let herself look at them, look at their faces, now full of realization, as if the world had shifted, and they were all part of something bigger than any of them could have imagined. She glanced back at 23B once more, and found him still looking out the window, his eyes distant now, like he had already left the plane in his mind, leaving them all behind with the truth that would never be spoken out loud. But somehow they all knew it. They all knew that the man sitting among them wasn't just any ordinary passenger. He wasn't just a quiet man in a hoodie. He was someone who had chosen to walk away from everything, and that in itself was enough to change the way they saw the world. The plane touched down softly, and as the seatbelt sign dinged, and the crew began their final preparations to disembark, Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that the journey wasn't really over, not for her, not for anyone on this flight. They were all leaving with a story, a mystery that would never fully be solved, but that was okay, because sometimes the questions were more important than the answers.